Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend, WTFW with another fiction. What if Deku to do's rescue mission for Katsumi? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Yua, Year 1 Sports Festival. Katsumi tied her blonde hair back into a high ponytail and readied herself for her match. She'd done a little research on the students in the hero course at UA, so she wasn't at a complete disadvantage. But watching Todoroki's match with the tape elbows guy, she knew she was in for a rough fight. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, eyeing her smoky gray eyes, trying to hide the nervousness written all over her face. Wiping her palms on the sides of her uniform, she stepped away from the mirror and started to pace the waiting room. Todoroki. Half hot, half cold. Though he never used his fire in a fight, and she didn't know why. She only hoped that she wouldn't be an exception to his senseless rule. Using only half of his quirk in a fight was like fighting at half strength all the time. So if he decided to use fire, she knew she would be done for. She wasn't sure if she could beat him at half strength in the first place, especially with her lack of practice with her own quirk. Katsumi hoped to be moved to the hero course at UA after the sports festival. It had been known to happen to a few students throughout UA, and she hoped she could show the administrators that they were wrong about her and her quirk. She could be a hero. She knew in her bones that being a hero was her destiny, and she would fight like hell to make it happen. Much like Todoroki, Katsumi pretty much had two quirks, half light, half shadow. She was still working on controlling her light quirk, but the shadows seemed to come easier to her. Perhaps this was the reason she wasn't led into the hero course. Without a flashy quirk, you can oftentimes get overlooked. The light was a flashy quirk for obvious reasons, but the shadows were subtle and quiet, and she was still learning to control and use them. She only hoped that the practice she'd been doing was enough to show them that she had potential. Before no time at all, it was time. She clenched her fists at her sides, trying to subdue the burning light in her palms that she'd yet learned to control. Deep breaths. She told herself. You can do this. You will do this. Katsumi knew in her heart that she probably wouldn't beat him, but she was going to try like hell to do it anyway. As she stepped out onto the arena, the crowd shouted and cheered, though more of it must have been for Todoroki, who was already on the opposing side of the arena. She did some circles with her elbows, trying to loosen up her shoulders and ignore her nerves. But as she stood opposite him, they crashed back down into place. She tried to listen to the intros that present mic gave for the two of them, but all she could hear was her pulse pounding in her ears. Taking in a deep breath, she took to her fighting stance and stared Todoroki down. His eyes were laser-focused on hers, but instead of the intensity she expected to find, his expression was laced with something else. Unsure of what to make of him, the match started, and she was already distracted. He came at her hard and fast with a wall of ice that she just barely dodged. Cold radiated from the ice, making her shiver, despite her racing heart and the heat she felt burning at her fingertips. She knew they were glowing, and she didn't even have to look at them. He wasted no time in launching another ice attack that threw her off balance. As she teetered, a third blow came, one that completely knocked her on her ass. No one had expected her to make it this far. The fact that she'd made it to the third event had taken everyone by surprise, especially her peers from the general studies class. She could hear them cheering from the sidelines, and it reminded her of why she was here. She needed to prove herself. Before Todoroki could take the offense, she harnessed the darkness and forced it to take the shape of wings at her back, and she launched herself into the air. Todoroki's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She had yet to use this move in the sports festival, so there was no way he'd know she could do this. From the air, she got a clear view of the arena, which was covered in chutes of ice, severely limiting the angles at which she could come for him. She thought that he must have set this up on purpose. With an ice wall at his back, she wouldn't be able to just shove him out of bounds. She could attack from the sky, but there would be no element of surprise. That was her only choice at the moment. Todoroki must have been tired of waiting for her to make a move, so he shot up a wall of ice that managed to knock her in the air, momentarily distracting her enough that the shadow wings disappeared. Her shadows were fickle things in the daytime, which was yet another reason that she needed to harness her light. She could be so much more powerful in the daytime if she could control it. Before she fell to the ground, she summoned the wings again, barely managing to keep herself from making contact with a hard surface. She bit the inside of her lip and rose into the air again. She wasn't sure what to do. With his ice barrages, he made it nearly impossible to get close. "Are you just going to hang out up there all day?" he shouted, throwing another blast. This one, she managed to dodge. Before she could think about her actions, she launched herself down toward his right side, shooting shadow tendrils from her palms out toward his ankles. He hadn't seen that coming and was knocked off his feet. "And Todoroki goes down," Present Mike shouted through the stadium. There was some cheering, but Katsumi tuned them out. "I don't think any of us saw that one coming." Todoroki was up again in no time, and Katsumi didn't have a chance to create distance between the two of them again as he grabbed her arm, freezing it up to her shoulder. She grimaced at the cold. "What? No fire?" she prodded. "Are you going easy on me, Todoroki?" Instead of a verbal response, he grabbed her frozen arm and ripped it down, flipping her through the air and onto her back, taking the breath right out of her lungs. The ice on her arm shattered, and she lay there dazed for a second before throwing herself onto her feet and sweeping a leg under him, which he easily dodged. An ice-covered fist launched at her face, and before she could even react, she threw up her hands, bringing up a wall of light. It shattered upon impact, but kept her face from being pounded in. A look of confusion crossed his face for a moment before he snapped back into the fight. Katsumi summoned her shadow wings again and skated away from him and behind his back, her feet just barely staying in bounds. Her heart raced at the realization that she'd almost thrown herself over the line, but she took a few steps forward. As Todoroki turned around, he threw the largest wall of ice at her yet, the top covered in frozen spikes, without looking too hard where he was aiming. Before Katsumi had a chance to dodge, the spikes came right at her, a few lodging themselves deep in her body. She let out a startled gasp as one went through her gut, and another shot right across her eye. She saw nothing but red in her right eye, so she squeezed it shut, trying to ignore the blood spilling down her cheek. Todoroki was just standing there staring at her, perhaps thinking he'd won. But Katsumi wasn't done. She grabbed the base of the spike in her stomach, summoned the light to her hands, and broke the ice tendril off, leaving it lodged in her gut. Despite that, she was free to move around. She knew she needed to leave it in and fight for however much longer she could. She was lasting a lot longer than any of his previous competitors already, and she didn't intend on going down easily. "I'm not done yet," she called as she ran at him, her wings of shadow propelling her forward. Her chest heaved, and she ignored the pain in her stomach as she raced forward. But Todoroki took a readying stance, letting her get in close. She was starting to get dizzy. The ice must have started to melt, as she felt liquid running down her front side. As she tried to keep moving forward, her shadow wings disappeared, and she stumbled across the cement. Her competitor simply stood there, his hands now at his sides as she fell to the ground. Everything was starting to get a bit fuzzy, and the last thing she heard was Midnight's voice. "Katsumi Ono has been KO'd. Shoto Todoroki wins the match." Then, everything went dark. Present day. Katsumi stepped through the doors of her building, the Angel Agency, and headed for her office. Upon her arrival, her co-owner of the agency was already waiting for her. Ochako Uraraka, or as the public knows her, Uravity. The Angel Agency was primarily a women's agency that saw to it that all female heroes got the same level of pay and respect as the male heroes. Having grown tired of the over-sexualization of female heroes, Katsumi wanted to create a comfortable workplace for all those aspiring for greatness. And Ochako was right on board with those ideals. "We have a meeting in 10 minutes, Ochako told her. "With who? I didn't see anything on the calendar yesterday." Katsumi plopped down in the chair at the desk and began sorting through some of her paperwork. "Shoto Todoroki's agency. And before you say no." "No." Katsumi rolled her eyes and looked back down at her paperwork. "You should hear me out first. His agency has some really strong leads on Mindmaker that he wants to go over with us. He thinks a team-up would be beneficial for the both of us." Katsumi sighed and leaned back in her chair, eyeing the ceiling tiles, pretending to be more interested in those than what Ochako was saying. "I know you're not a fan of Shoto, but I think it's a good move, don't you?" Aches came around to Katsumi's side of the desk and patted her cheeks. "Besides, I'll take you out to lunch afterward, of course. Anywhere you want as a reward." "A reward?" Katsumi cocked her eyebrow. "Yes, of course. I know it'll be hard, but I want you to come with me, and I want you to play nice this time." She recalled the last time she and Shoto were forced to team up. The banter between the two of them almost got between them and their target. She could hardly focus enough around him to get anything done. He infuriated her that much. But if it was Mindmaker he had leads on, it might just be worth it. "Fine. Great. They're already waiting for us down in the conference room. Let's go." "Already here?" Katsumi thought to herself. Ochako must have been sure she'd be able to convince her then. "You head down, I'll be there in a second," Katsumi told her. Ochako nodded and left the office, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Sighing, she stood up from the chair and headed for the door, but stopped when she placed her hand on the handle. Her reflection in the glass panel on the door stared back at her, and she pressed her fingers into the scarred tissue on her right cheekbone. Her right eye, which she could no longer see out of, was equally as ugly and scarred, and all glossed over in a light blue. She could have had the eye removed altogether and replaced with a glass one. But back when she'd received that wound at the sports festival in her first year at UA, she decided to keep it as a reminder of what happens when you don't try hard enough. When you're not prepared. Leaving the room, she decided that she'd play nice if Shoto did as well. She wasn't one to take the high ground when it came to pompous assholes like him. Upon entering the conference room, everyone was already seated. "Nice of you to join us, fallen angel," Shoto stated without looking at her. "Thank you for waiting." Katsumi, known as Fallen Angel in the hero world, took the empty seat next to Uraraka. "I hear you have some leads on Mindmaker that I might be interested in." "Right down to business as usual, I see," he stated, finally looking in her direction. His eyes were cold, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. She was never able to do that. No reason to beat around the bush and drag this out longer than it has to be. She put her elbows up on the table and rested her chin on her fists. Ochako was already pinching Katsumi's thigh under the table, and she shot her a pleading look, begging her friend to play nice. "I will if he does," is the look she returned. "We have tabs on someone he was with during the last attack." Shoto crossed his arms over his chest and leaned back in his chair. "I've had someone tailing him for a few days, seeing where he leads us. But we're thinking we might need to have more experienced heroes tailing him, in case it leads us to their base." That's right. We'd yet to figure out where they were hiding. Mindmaker has been gathering lower-level thugs for a while now, and we haven't been able to figure out what he was after, or where he was basing his operations. "You think this thug will lead you to Mindmaker's base?" Ochako interjected. "And what would the plan be if we finally find it?" "That's to be determined. We have to find it first to plan anything for certain. But it won't be a small affair by any means. Mindmaker is a high-level villain, and I'm afraid I can't trust my sidekicks not to get into trouble if this lead takes us anywhere." It made sense. So far, we didn't know much about Mindmaker's quirk. Similar to Shinso from high school, his quirk was mind control. but we'd noticed an increased range in that control. And the things he was able to make his victims do were way more intricate than any mind control quirk they'd seen yet. We'd hypothesized that the control was solely upon eye contact, but there was no way to be sure. They hadn't had enough run-ins with the guy to determine anything like that. "And who are you proposing we send after this guy?" Katsumi asked. "Well, me of course, and you," Shoto stated. Katsumi simply scoffed in response. "What? Are you too good for this kind of mission? I know you like to stick to flashier affairs." "My answer is no," she stated firmly. "And that is not why I'm saying no. How do you expect this to go?" "Not well, judging by our past team-ups. It's a stupid proposition." "I told you she'd say no," Shoto said, shooting Uravity a look. She sighed next to Katsumi, which ticked her off even more. "You already knew about this proposition?" Katsumi asked her sharply. "Well, yeah, I thought we'd at least hear him out." Her friend shifted next to her in her seat. "It's not a completely bogus solution. You're known for your stealth abilities, and he's one of the best. I can't think of two better suited heroes for the job." "Uravity actually has a brain," Shoto chuffed. "Unlike you, who is unable to see past our prior conflicts. I can be a mature adult about this, but can you?" "I'll think about it," Katsumi finally said after a small pause. "And you really couldn't think of anyone else to ask? You think you were my first choice? I'm here because you're the only one with the skill set I'm after who's available for a mission right now." Katsumi rolled her eyes and began to stand up from her seat. "I need an answer now," Shoto said, making Katsumi stop in her tracks. She admitted to herself that it was a good game plan. But she didn't like the idea of working so closely with him. He made it so hard for her to keep her remarks to himself, and she seemed to have the same effect on him. "Fine. Yes." Katsumi headed to the door. "Send me the details as soon as you can, and I'll be in contact with you. Ochako, I believe you promised me lunch." She shot up from her chair and followed Katsumi out of the room. "You're still failing to see the bigger picture here," Ochako stated, taking another bite of her sandwich. "What more is there to it?" Katsumi sighed. "Follow the thug, find the base, and don't make it go on longer than it has to. I'm going to make quick work of this. This could open up more opportunities for team-ups in the future, if you play your cards right. Like I'd want to team up with him again." This was purely being done out of necessity. Nothing more. Unless it was absolutely necessary, she didn't want to spend time around Shoto. "We could use the publicity, if not for anything else. Our agency is doing well already, but facing higher-tier villains like the other agencies could not only help our recruitment rate, but also our personal hero rankings in the long run." Katsumi sighed again. "I guess you're right. But like I said this morning, I'm only going to be a good sport about this if he intends on not being a dick." Ochako chucked. "What's funny? You've always been so weird about him, even back in school. All the girls had crushes on him, but you just wanted to blow his head off. The other girls were jealous because, despite the little rivalry you had going, he gave you attention. And they were stupid to crush on him. They just liked his looks anyway." Even Katsumi couldn't deny that Shoto was good-looking, but she'd never admit that out loud, not even to Ochako. She only wiggled her eyebrows at Katsumi before turning her attention back to her sandwich. It was a nice day outside, so they'd chosen to eat out on the patio of the little restaurant Katsumi chose. There were a few clouds in the sky, but it was a mostly sunny day with a light breeze. It was April, so the trees along the streets were flowering and budding, and it was truly a peaceful sight. Suddenly, something, or someone rather, blasted by on the sidewalk next to them, the backlash of the power blowing their lunches right off the table. Katsumi stood up abruptly and summoned her light wings and prepared to chase off after whoever it was, and Ochako was already right there with her. Not even a second after the first runner, someone else flew by overhead, a string of explosions filling the air behind them, and a familiar voice shouting goading insults at the runner. Katsuki Bakuga, of course. She and Ochako took off after the two of them. The files came across her desk that afternoon from Shoto's agency. The thing had traveled to a neighboring city a few hours away, and they'd yet to track him back to any notable location. He'd been meeting up with other low-level thugs, perhaps attempting to recruit them to his boss's cause. Whatever that may be, that would be another thing they'd need to find out. So far, Mindmaker had just been causing trouble, upsetting peace, and making political statements that held little to no real meaning. Katsumi assumed it was all just a ruse to get people involved in his cause. Katsumi leaned back in her chair after reading the last part of the memo. Shoto wanted to leave for the neighboring city that night to not lose any time. That left little time for her to mentally prepare. She wanted this over with as quickly as possible. But there was no telling how long it would take to find Mindmaker's base. Heading to the back room in her office, she placed her palm on the scanner by the door, opening up a secret closet that held her various hero costume variations. Knowing this was supposed to be an undercover operation, she knew she needed to opt for one of her costumes that could easily be changed into or worn under baggier clothing. With that in mind, she picked out the long-sleeved zip-up bodysuit. That would be the easiest and most comfortable to wear under normal clothing. The suit allowed for a wide range of movement without compromising her chest to the awful shots that the media tended to take of her upper body. The zipper went all the way to her neck, so there would be no cleavage. The last thing she wanted was another fanservice magazine to publish her pictures. As a hero, there's not a lot you can do to stay out of the tabloids, so it often just comes down to preemptive thinking and damage control. The black bodysuit had some purple accents to go with her newly dyed hair. She was tired of the pure blonde locks she'd had her whole life and took to dyeing the bottom half different colors, the most recent being purple. Dyeing her hair every so often seemed to give the media something vanity-wise for them to focus on about her, rather than other things, which she preferred. After dressing herself in the costume, she threw on a pair of baggy black jeans and a zip-up sweater. She braided her hair in a long braid down her back and grabbed a pair of sunglasses and an over-the-shoulder bag. She looked herself over in the mirror and thought that she looked like a normal citizen. Some heroes with more unique looks had a harder time hiding their identities, but Katsumi didn't have that problem too bad. Thinking about Shoto, she at least hoped he had the decency to hide the beacon that was his head of hair under some kind of hat. Even dressed as a civilian, Shoto was prone to drawing attention. There were whole blogs dedicated to spotting him doing regular person things in public. She understood why she was wanted for a task like this, but Shoto was going to make it difficult. Of course, it was his lead they were going off of, which meant he had to be involved. She only wished that she'd come across it herself so she could solo this mission. But no, the universe had other plans for her. She headed out of her office through the now mostly empty building and onto the street. Shoto wanted her to meet him at his agency, so she shot him a message on her phone, letting him know that she was on the way. It was nearly dark outside already as she made the walk across the city. It was a pretty quiet night for the city, she noticed. Most people would relish in the quiet, but it always put Katsumi on edge. Upon her arrival at Shoto's agency, she tried the front door, and it was locked. She glanced down at her phone to see that she was perfectly on time according to Shoto's request. She was about to shoot him another text, but she saw him in the building through the glass doors, heading for her. He came out and locked the doors behind himself before turning to face her. "Thank you for coming," he stated. "Yep." She crossed her arms over her chest, not sure why they were still just standing there. He wore a similar dark attire as her, with a navy blue beanie on his head, covering his hair. "We can take the bullet train over. Should only take an hour and a half to get there," he told her. He suddenly stepped forward and reached around her, and she was taken back and removed herself from his hands rather quickly. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, frowning at him. His expression held no indication of his intentions as he stared her down. Your hair, he told her. It's rather noticeable, don't you think? He reached around her again, taking the long, purple braid and tucking it into the back of her jacket. Her eyebrows were pressed into a line as she kept her eyes focused on the light blue Chuck Taylors he wore. When he was finished, she instantly relaxed when there was space between them again. He walked a few paces away from her before turning around. You ready? Yeah, sure, she said, catching up with him. 12 years ago, Katsumi, age 11. You have to get up, hon, her mother said in a sweet voice. Katsumi lay on the ground in a heap, tired out from the overuse of her light quirk. Her skin burned, and even calling in her shadows did little to satiate the aches all across her body. Despite the sweetness in her mother's voice, Katsumi knew what she'd see if she were to look up at her mom's face. Pure coldness and disinterest. She didn't know why her mother was doing this to her. Well, she had the reasons her mom told her, but it still didn't make sense for her to be pushed so hard when she was barely able to control her quirk yet. Her mother would tell her over and over again why she was born, why she was created. Her mother didn't love her, no. At least, Katsumi didn't think so. She'd heard the other students in her class talk about their families in loving ways. But her home life had never been like that. Her father, completely withdrawn, never spoke to her. Her mother ignored her unless her mom decided it was time for another practice session. She was a disappointment. She knew that. Her mom made sure to tell her that every single time she lay in a heap on the ground, rendered useless by her own quirk. Get up, Katsumi, get up. Her mother whipped at her with her shadows, causing the child to cry out. She only whipped her again. Get up, we're not done yet. Present day. Katsumi woke up with her face resting against the cold glass of the bullet train window. Shoto sat across from her, giving her a puzzled look. She averted her eyes and focused on the darkened landscape out the window. How close are we? She asked. About 30 minutes out. Shoto crossed one of his legs over the other, and with a side-eye glance, she saw that Shoto was still staring at her. What? She asked sharply. Is no one allowed to look at you now? He prodded. I certainly don't want you staring me down all the time. She stuck her tongue out at him and frowned. He rolled his eyes and fixed his gaze out the window as well. They arrived at the station 30 minutes later as promised, and entered the city. Shoto looked down at the map on his phone and led them to the rendezvous point sent to him by the sidekick currently following their target. Walking through the city side by side, they finally came up on the meeting location. He's currently in the bar right across the street there, his sidekick told us. The place is known for a lot of under-the-table villain activity. Thank you, Shoto said. Then, he dismissed them. They stayed in the alleyway across the street, eyeing the entrance to the bar, waiting for their man. The target was a man in his mid-30s who was registered with a shielding quirk. Not much on its own, but it definitely could pose an issue if used in conjunction with their main target, Mindmaker. It could make it more difficult to make an arrest if they got that far. How long do you think he's going to be in there? She asked Shoto, breaking the silence that had grown between them. They sat behind a dumpster, keeping their eyes on the entrance of the bar, growing impatient already. I'm just curious what his patterns are. Katsumi shifted her body and crouched down on the balls of her feet, stretching her arms over her head. So far, he hasn't frequented the same place twice. No patterns. Shoto looked down at her with his arms crossed over his chest. You're staring again, she stated. Shouldn't you be keeping your eyes on the target? He didn't respond, but instead turned his gaze back to the bar. Right as he did so, the man stepped through the entrance and started to walk down the street with his hands in the pocket of his hoodie. After waiting a second to create some distance, they headed off down the street after him. The first night on the job warranted no result. The man made a few more stops before checking in at a hotel where he stayed for the remainder of the night. On the rooftop from where they watched the hotel, Shoto and Katsumi took turns resting, while the other kept their eyes on the building. In the morning, the man left the hotel, got a coffee, and did nothing strange or noteworthy. He went to a shopping center and bought a change of clothes, which at least told them that he was traveling, had the hotel not told them that already. He had yet to lead them anywhere of importance. "Are you sure this is the right guy?" Katsumi asked her partner. She leaned against a brick building and stuck her hands in her pockets. "Are you doubting my intel?" he retorted. "No, I'm just saying he hasn't done a single suspicious thing for hours. We've only just started." Shoto pulled the beanie from his head and raked a hand through his matted hair before putting it back on. He wore a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses much like the ones Katsumi wore, which shielded their recognizable eyes. "There's still plenty of time for us to learn something. Patience must not be a trait of yours, then." His saying, "they've only just started," is what annoyed her. She didn't want this dragging on any longer than it had to. She had no interest in spending her time with Shoto. He was annoying just to look at, let alone talk to. She sighed and adjusted her sunglasses on the bridge of her nose. "I'm patient. I'm just not fond of being here with you." "Do I really bother you that much?" he scoffed. "Yeah," she stated plainly. "Like I stated, I'm able to be professional about this. But are you? You've been acting extremely bothered this whole time. I don't want your attitude problem to get in the way of this mission. This is important." "I don't have an attitude problem," she frowned. "Yes, you do. And you don't. I'm a professional. I don't let feelings get in the way of my work." Katsumi rolled her eyes and looked back to the restaurant that their target sat in, eating a bowl of noodles. Her stomach growled, and she rubbed her abdomen with her hand. If she didn't get something to eat here soon, then she would start to have an attitude. "I don't have like you," she told him. "Let's just get through this, okay? I won't cause any issues if you don't." His jaw twitched in annoyance. "You always start the issues." His eyes narrowed at her, but she brushed him off, focusing back on the target. "He's on the move again," she stated, changing the subject. Once again, they walked down the street together, tailing after the thug. When the guy stopped again, Katsumi turned into a convenience store and purchased some food for the two of them that they could eat while they worked. Shoto took it from her with a quiet thank you and trained his eyes back on the target. This was going to be a long and boring mission, Katsumi thought. The following day passed, and no new discoveries were made. Katsumi kept quiet most of the day, not wanting Shoto to call her out for her attitude problem again. He never said much, either. Walking through the streets, Katsumi noticed that the city seemed to be gearing up for some kind of festival. She asked Shoto if he knew anything about it, and of course, he had an answer. "It's a spring festival the locals put together every year. Quite a beautiful thing, if not for all the crime below the surface of it. I'm surprised you've never heard of it." "I don't have time for a lot of vacations," she replied. She looked around the streets at the lights being strung through the cherry blossom trees and the streets being blocked off for vendors and other small events. He was right, it was very beautiful. Perhaps other children went to these types of things when they were kids, but not Katsumi. Her family dynamic had always been a bit strange compared to other kids. She didn't like dwelling on that sort of thing, but she would always feel jealous of others and the opportunities they got that she didn't. They took a turn into the city park, which was just as equally dressed up as the streets they'd been walking down. She supposed this would be a romantic setting for some, if they were into that sort of thing. Katsumi didn't really have the time to ever be thinking about those sorts of things. She reminded herself of that when she looked down the path at their target, who was weaving through the gathering crowds. It could be easy to lose him in this setting if they weren't careful. "Shift change in an hour, by the way," Shoto reminded her. "I've contacted a trusted agency in the area, and they've agreed to send someone out to relieve us for the night, so we can get some proper rest." Katsumi nodded and continued down the path at Shoto's side. She glanced over at him and noticed the lights from the trees swimming in his eyes and highlighting his cheekbones, and she forced herself to look away. Shoto was conventionally attractive. That she knew there was nothing else to note except that. That was why she sometimes found herself looking at him when he wasn't paying attention. Nothing more. When the other heroes came to relieve them of their duties, Katsumi pulled up a list of hotels in the area that had vacancies and found only one. They must all be packed for the festival, she commented as she looked through. They headed off out of the park and to the hotel. It wasn't shabby by any means, but it definitely wasn't state-of-the-art either. They walked through the front door. A woman sat at the counter with a magazine in her hand and looked at them with bored eyes as they approached. "Just the two of you?" she asked. They nodded. "How long you staying?" "One night," Katsumi replied. She drummed her fingertips against the counter as the woman scrolled through the computer, the screen lighting up her face in the dimly lit reception area. "Ah, right there," said the woman, clicking her mouse. "We've got one room left. It's a single bed. Will that be all right?" Shoto scoffed behind her, and she considered it for a moment before responding. "That's fine." The woman held out a key, and Katsumi took it from her. "Fourth floor," she told them. Katsumi headed for the stairs and Shoto trailed behind her. "Are you kidding?" he scoffed. "It's all they have." Katsumi hit a landing on the stairs and turned to go up the next set. "What else do you propose? Isn't there anywhere else?" Internet said this was the only place with vacancy. She looked down at the key and checked the room number before starting up the steps again. "You can't possibly be suggesting that we share a bed, are you?" "I can be a mature adult about this, can you?" she said, using his own words against him. "It's just for one night. It's not going to kill you." He sighed and followed her as she left the stairwell and turned down a hallway. He didn't say anything as they entered the room, which was remarkably small. "I was going to suggest that you could sleep on the floor, but I don't think there's room," Katsumi stated. There was a little bit of floor space in front of the bed, but it fit perfectly into the room with no floor on either side. Off to the left, there was a bathroom, but it was also small, and even combined with the floor space of the room, it wouldn't be enough for a person to fully lie down. Opening the closet, there were a couple of sets of sleeping clothes folded on the bottom shelf. Katsumi took a pair, headed for the bathroom, and locked the door behind herself. She started to take out her braid when Shoto knocked on the door. "What?" she asked sharply. "Do you want me to order takeout?" he asked. "Sure." He paused for a moment. "What do you want?" "I don't care. You pick." She turned her attention back to her reflection and started to comb her fingers through her hair. After she was done combing out the knots, she took a quick shower. By the time she left the bathroom, Shoto was receiving the food delivery at the door. He handed her a box, and they both sat on the edge of the bed and ate in silence. After their meal, he headed for the bathroom, leaving Katsumi alone in the room. She shuffled across the mattress, bringing herself close to the window that was at the head of the bed. Looking out onto the streets below, she watched the crowds move through the beautifully lit streets of the spring festival. Part of her wished she could be one of those people, sometimes someone who didn't have the responsibilities that a hero did. But that thought quickly faded when she thought about why she became a hero in the first place. She'd always wanted to be a symbol for people. Someone that others could rely on to always do the right thing. According to the tabloids, she'd definitely succeeded in at least becoming an icon for young girls out there who aspired to be heroes. She hoped that her agency would live on even past her time to continue to offer a comfortable work environment for women. The door to the bathroom swung open, and a plume of steam filtered into the room. "Damn, did you forget to turn the ventilation in there?" Katsumi teased. He looked around the corner of the bathroom and flipped a switch, and the low hum of the fan turned on. "I didn't even know there was one." Shoto leaned forward and ran the towel through his hair again before shaking his head to loosen the strands. He wore the other set of sleepwear that was included in the room. It was a pair of gray pants and a black long-sleeve shirt, which was similar to what Katsumi wore. After setting the towel down, he stood at the end of the bed, looking unsure. Katsumi scooted to the left side of the bed, as close to the wall as she could. There was only one blanket, unfortunately, meaning they'd have to share that as well. "I don't bite," she jabbed. Shoto scoffed. "That's not true." "Fine, I won't bite. How's that?" "Better." He crawled across the bed, taking the right side, also scooting as close to the wall as he could, trying to create as much space between the two of them as he could. Katsumi almost laughed at how tense and awkward he was being, but didn't want to make it any more weird than it already was. Katsumi flicked out a tendril of her shadow and flipped the switch in the room, putting out the lights. They laid down and tried to get comfortable. She found it hard, seeing as Shoto wanted to hog all the blankets. She ripped them back, probably leaving him exposed to the cool air, but was now satisfied with the amount of blanket she had. It was his fault for trying to be a hog in the first place. "What the hell?" he asked, ripping them right back. She sat up and grabbed the edge, trying to pull them back, but he'd tucked the other side under his body. She reached over to undo that, but he caught her arm and pushed her back over to her side of the bed. "Not cool," she said. "I need some blanket, too. It's cold." "You lost that chance when you decided to get rude." He turned to face the wall, ignoring her request completely. Once again, she reached over, this time gripping the edge of the blanket. He reacted quickly, grabbing both her arms and flipping Katsumi onto her back with her arms pinned over her head to the mattress. Shoto's breath caught in his throat when he looked down at her, and both of them froze. His face was close enough to hers that she felt his hair tickle her forehead. She finally unfroze and ripped her hands from his hold. "Get off me," she exclaimed. He quickly obliged, sliding off and back over to his side of the bed, this time not pinning the blanket underneath them. They both remained quiet for the rest of the night. When Katsumi woke up the next morning, she was startled to feel an arm wrapped firmly around her waist. She was about to turn around and wake Shoto up, but froze when he stirred, frightening his grip around her. He pulled her body close to his, and she was absolutely mortified when his lower half pressed into her, and she could feel his morning erection against her bottom. Afraid she would wake him, she lay still, waiting for him to stir first. She didn't want any more awkward situations between the two of them, and didn't want him to know she'd woken and felt him against her like that. He let out a soft moan against her neck when he started to wake, and her face reddened. She wasn't quite sure what to do. His lower half ground against her in his sleep, and she remained completely rigid, waiting for it to end. She hated the fact that she was sort of turned on, feeling him against her like that. She pressed her thighs together, trying to ignore the sensations in her own body, waiting for him to wake up. She tried to covertly slide away from him, but his arm only gripped her waist tighter. There would be no freedom for her until he woke up. Eventually, he did, and he slowly removed his arm from her waist and slid back against the wall, letting out a quiet yawn. She followed suit, pretending that she'd just woken up as well, not looking at him yet, as she knew her face was still beet red. She finally let out the breath she'd been holding when Todoroki rose from the bed and headed for the bathroom. She turned onto her side and looked out the window, seeing that the sun was just rising. Checking her phone, they still had 3 hours until they were supposed to relieve the heroes currently keeping an eye on their target. She wondered if they'd discovered anything more than she and Shoto had been able to the past 24 hours. A text notification from Ochako appeared at the top of her phone screen, and Katsumi clicked open the chat. "Did you see this article? You two have been spotted," the text read. Katsumi frowned and clicked the link that Ochako sent her. It led her to an Instagram profile with 1 million followers, And the most recent post was a picture of her and Shoto in the park last night. Looking at the profile a bit closer, she snorted when she read the profile username, which was Shochin's girlfriend. Katsumi filed that nickname away to use against Shoto later. When she clicked on the picture, she read the caption. Shoto Todoroki was spotted last night in the park, attending the annual spring festival with a mystery woman. No details on who she is, but I say this for everyone when I say that I am disappointed. I hope he hasn't found himself a new girlfriend. Katsumi frowned and navigated back over to Okacho's text chat. What the hell is that? She sent back. I don't know what they saw, but there's no way they think I'm his girlfriend. Pictures don't lie, Ochako responded with a winky face emoji. Katsumi reopened the picture and took a closer look. It was taken from the front. Katsumi was looking up at the lights with a small smile on her face, but Shoto's eyes were fixed entirely on her. Looking at the picture from an outside view, she understood how it could be misconstrued the way Shoto's fans had taken it. But she knew him and his disdain toward her. They just caught him at a weird time, and it made it look like he was eyeing her like that. His eyes were full of warmth, which wasn't something she saw on his face, ever. Shoto came out of the bathroom, softly closing the door behind himself. He regarded her with a small nod. We were spotted last night in the park, Katsumi told him, holding up her phone. One of your fangirl sites was all over it. I have lots of fangirl pages, so I doubt that anyone really paid any attention to that. This page has like 1 million followers, she told him. There's like 300,000 likes already. We'll have to be way more careful today, now that your fangirls know you're here. She said the last part with finger quotations. It was exactly the kind of thing that Katsumi had initially worried about. If a swarm of girls were going to be following them everywhere, it would make their mission nearly impossible. Shoto sighed and sat down on the edge of the bed with his face in his hands. It's okay, Sho-chan, she said, patting his back, holding in a chuckle. Yeah, she was annoyed, but at least she could poke fun at him over this. Please do not start calling me that, he sighed. It's too late for that, Sho-chan. She smirked and walked over to the bathroom. They were finally beginning to gain some good intel on the guy when they followed him into a dark and dirty alleyway, where he met up with another stranger. From their spot behind the dumpster, they could hear their conversation. I'm not interested in something like that, the stranger told our target. We all saw how that played out with that whole League of Villains thing last time. I'm not interested in participating in organized crime like that. This is nothing like the League of Villains. This is different. It's just a place where we can gather and not have to worry about the weight of everything, if you get me, said our target. Just a place where you can lay low, and they already told me that it's your choice or not what things you participate in once you get there. Think of it like a safe place. That does sound interesting. I might check it out if it's what you're saying it is. You know you can trust me. They were stupid, thinking no one could hear them talking about this place so loudly. Listening in, the target didn't give any details on where the place was. They overheard our guy say he'd send the other the location on his phone, so it was obvious we weren't going to get much more out of listening to the conversation. After he left the alleyway, Shoto and Katsumi followed the guy. While they did so, the thug made many more similar stops that day, all sharing the same amount of details. It was obvious he'd been at least told not to say the location out loud. They could either keep following the guy and see if he led them back to the base or try something else. Katsumi, not wanting this to go on longer than it had to, was leaning toward the latter. Shoto, however, wasn't keen on making contact with the target in any capacity. We could talk to one of the others about it, Katsumi suggested. Say we overheard and that we're interested. There's a good chance they'll recognize us close up like that, though. That's not a risk I want to take. Then I'll do it. You're way more recognizable than I am. She folded her arms over her chest and leaned against the red brick wall of the alley they were in. Their target was taking a lunch break across the street, so they had a minute to discuss this. I can keep my hood up and wear my sunglasses, and there's no way they'll recognize me. Your fans didn't even put it together, and they got a picture of us and everything. I said no. I don't want to jeopardize this mission. You know how important this is, right? How stupid what you're saying is? He narrowed his eyes at her, but she held his stare, not backing down. Being a hero means you need to know when to take appropriate risks. And I think this is one of those times. I'm going to approach one of the thugs and see if I can get some information. If it goes badly, it's not like I can't defend myself. But we're supposed to remain undercover. He bit. You're being reckless. Look, I don't want to spend more time on this mission than I have to. And I can assume you feel the same way. There's no reason to drag this on any longer than it has to. Shoto looked away from her and clenched his jaw shut. There would be no getting through to her, and he knew that. Fine. But keeping your identity hidden is your top priority. At any point things start not to work out, you come back. Deal? You act like you're the one giving the orders here, Katsumi scoffed. This is a team up. You don't get to tell me what to do. With that reasoning, this should be a joint decision. But you're not listening to me at all. Because you're not listening to me, she retorted, pulling the hood of her jacket over her hair. She grabbed the sunglasses from her pocket and put them on before looking back at Shoto, who had remained silent. He looked at her with a burning gaze, his mouth drawn into a thin line. I'm off, she told him, heading down the alley toward the last person their target spoke with. Be careful, he finally said. You don't think I can handle myself? I never said that, he stated coolly. I'm just asking you to be careful, okay? Fine. I'll keep you updated. Keep your eyes on our guy. I know. Then, Katsumi headed off after the thug, leaving Shoto alone in the alleyway. She headed off in the direction of the thug that she and Shoto had spotted talking to their target. She watched him turn off into a bar at the end of the street, so she entered the establishment shortly after he did. She took a seat at the bar where she could see the guy sitting in the corner. He ordered a drink, and she did too, not wanting to look too out of place. She sipped on hers for several minutes, not ingesting too much, but she waited until the guy had downed several before heading over to the table. Leaning against the table, she pushed her sunglasses down to the end of her nose and flashed her eyes at him. Is this seat taken? She placed her hand on the table opposite the stranger. What's a beautiful thing like you doing in a place like this? He asked. His voice was low and gravelly, and she could already see his face warming from the looks she gave him. She hated doing this, but it was the easiest way to get what she wanted. Same as you, I suppose, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. She gingerly set her drink down on the table after taking a long sip. His eyes were completely fixed on her as she dragged her tongue against her bottom lip slowly, catching the stray drops of the beverage. Folding her arms on the surface of the table, she shoved them under her chest, accentuating her assets. It seemed to be working. The thug couldn't keep his eyes off of her. She'd banked on him being a total perv, and it seemed that she was right. She picked her beverage up off the table and finished off the contents of the glass, setting it down on the table with a light thud. Can I get you another one? He asked quickly. If you insist, she smiled. The guy called over the waiter, who dropped off another round shortly after. What's your name, beautiful? He asked, his voice low. You can just call me May, she said, wrapping her hands gently around the glass. She ran the tips of her fingers over the rim of the glass slowly, and the man seemed to be mesmerized. And what can I call you? The name's Soto, he replied, downing most of his drink. The man was visibly tipsy, which would make this so much easier for Katsumi. I had a question to ask you, she said, cutting right to the chase. You seem like someone a girl can trust, right? You can ask me anything, baby doll, he grinned. I might have overheard you and that other guy earlier, And I have to say, I'm kind of intrigued in what he was offering, she said. He cocked an eyebrow at her, but he didn't seem too suspicious of her. Crazy what a pair of tits could do to a guy. Oh, you heard that? He said, scratching his head. I'm not really supposed to be talking about that if you get me. Not really something they want getting out, especially after what happened a few years ago. Oh, I know, but that's why I came to you, she stated. It can be so hard to find like-minded people, but when I saw you, I just knew. I'm just a girl, you know? It's not safe for me to be out all on my own with all those heroes running things the way they are, and it seems like something I can get behind. A big, strong man like you can understand that, right? I catch your drift, he said, taking another drink. If I tell you the place, you have to promise not to invite anyone else. And you can't tell them I sent you, got that? Oh, I won't. You can trust me. Katsumi rested her hand on his, and he lit up, puffing his chest. This was a lot easier than she thought it would be. All she had to do was flirt with the guy. Katsumi opened her phone and quickly made a new profile on one of those messaging apps, getting a bogus number before letting him send her the location. And that was it. She now held a set of coordinates that would lead them right to Mindmaker. She did it. Leaving the bar was a little more tedious, having to escape this guy who thought she was interested in him. She waited for him to run to the bathroom, knowing that would be inevitable, given how much he'd drank. Standing up from her seat, she swayed just a little bit, not having realized how much she'd drank herself. The guy had her on their fourth round before he finally got up to use the restroom, and she'd been forced to play along until then. Hobbling out of the bar, she walked a few blocks away before pulling out her cell again and opening her chat with Shoto. "Where are you?" she sent him. It took him all of a second to send a reply. "Are you all right? Do you need me to come to you?" Katsuki rolled her eyes at his response. "I'm fine. I just need to know where you are so I can meet back up." Shoto sent her his location, an outdoor shopping center a few blocks away. She walked down the streets, trying to ignore how drunk she was, not wanting to catch anyone's attention. It was starting to get late, so drunk people on the streets weren't necessarily odd, especially given the fact that the spring festival was still happening a few blocks away near the park. She finally reached the outlet mall and spotted Shoto seated at the edge of a water fountain. When she reached him, she plopped down on the stone surface right next to him. "And you were worried for nothing," she said, shoulder bumping him. She hiccuped, which caused him to frown down at her. "Are you drunk?" he exclaimed. "Are you the police?" she retorted. She hiccuped again. "Oh my God, you are." He grabbed her arm and lifted her to her feet. "What are you doing?" she said, trying to wiggle free of his hands, not having much luck in her state. The alcohol was unfortunately affecting her more now. She regretted not having much to eat that day, and paired with her low body fat levels and low tolerance, it wasn't ever a good idea for her to drink. "We're leaving. This is far too public a place for this kind of thing." He led her out of the shopping center, gripping her by the elbow. "You're way overreacting, Sho-chan," she laughed. "What did you do that involved you having to get this drunk? Did he do anything to you?" he asked, stopping her. He searched her eyes for something, but she didn't know what he was looking for. He had even reacted to her calling him that nickname, which bothered her slightly, but she didn't press it. "What do you mean?" she asked, frowning. He had her gripped by both arms, and he leveled his face with hers. "You know what I mean." "I really don't," she stated. "You act like I can't look out for myself. I'm a pro-fucking hero, and you're acting ridiculous." That was a low-level thug I could have taken in my sleep if anything had gone awry. "But you're drunk. You're obviously not fit to handle yourself right now." He finally let go of her and dug his phone out of his pocket. He dialed someone and put the phone up to his ear. "What are you doing?" Katsumi asked him, but he ignored her. "Hello?" "Yes, we're ready to be relieved for the night," he said into the phone. We're at the outlet mall. Yes, he's still here. Yes, thank you. He hung up and pocketed the device. We're not due to be off for another hour or two, at least, Katsumi stated. She tried to back away from him, but stumbled, and Shoto caught her arm. You're obviously in no state to be working right now. You didn't even ask me if I got it. Got what? He'd been entirely too focused on the fact that she'd been drinking to ask her anything else, which was pissing her off. He was acting like she just went off by herself to get drunk, when that's not at all what she'd been doing. The location of the base. I got it, Shoto, she told him. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. And you had to get drunk to do that? No. But it's easier to flirt with trashy men if I have something to distract myself with. You flirted with someone else? He asked, growing visibly angry. His left fist sparked, and he squeezed his eyes shut, trying to recenter himself. It was the best course of action. I don't get why you're so upset about this. I don't want to talk about it anymore, he stated coolly. Their replacements came and took over their post, and then Shoto dragged her off down the street. He was taking turns looking between his phone and where they were headed, eventually leading them to a hotel. This one was nicer than the one they stayed in last. After checking in, he led them up to the room and pushed her inside before closing the door behind them. I still don't get why you're so mad about this, Katsumi argued, following Shoto into the room. I got what we were after having nothing to go on for days. That's not what I'm mad about, he stated, heading over to the closet in the room. Picking out a set of sleeping clothes, he shoved them into her arms and pushed her into the bathroom. Just get ready for bed. We'll talk about how to move forward with the mission in the morning, when you're sober. After closing herself inside, Katsumi leaned against the bathroom door and let out a breath. She quickly dressed herself for sleep, groaning at the fact that he handed her a pair of loose shorts. That was more skin than she liked to show, but she was obviously in no place to be arguing with him about a second thing at the moment. She stepped out of the bathroom and frowned at Todoroki, who was leaning against the window, staring down at the street below. I still don't know why you're so mad, she said, crossing the room to where she stood. She was pushing him, she knew it. But she liked to tease him, and he was making it so easy at the moment. You were stupid and reckless, he stated. And I said I didn't want to talk about it anymore. No, tell me why, she said, goading him. Not knowing what came over her, she traced her finger along his shoulder, and he tensed. Are you jealous, Shoto Todoroki? She asked. His jaw flexed, and he faced away from her, shielding her from his expression. No. Then what? Why are you so mad about this? I did what I... Before she had a chance to finish her statement, he turned around swiftly, grabbed her by the waist, and pinned her to the wall next to them. He grabbed a handful of her hair and yanked back, forcing her to bare her neck to him. He skated his lips across her neck, his breath causing her skin to pebble under the light brush of his mouth against her pulse. He kicked her foot, widening her stance, pushing his lower half into hers. Her breath caught in her throat, and her mind turned to pudding. What are you? She trailed off when his lips brushed her ear, and she had to stop the moan that threatened to escape her lips before he heard it. She wouldn't let him have the satisfaction of knowing he got to her so easily like that, even though her core was throbbing from his simple touches. Look how easy it would be for someone to take advantage of you right now, he whispered against her ear, sending shivers down her spine. And you didn't even try to stop me. This is different, she stuttered. He splayed his hand wide across her hip and gave her a gentle squeeze, causing her to let out a small sound. He could do whatever he wanted to her right now, and she wouldn't stop him. Why didn't she want to stop him? When would you ever let me do something like this to you? He asked. You hate me. How is this any different? Before she could respond, he pulled away from her and quickly headed for the bathroom, slamming the door behind himself. Katsumi leaned her head against the wall and tried to catch her breath. still not fully comprehending what had just happened. She knew she hated him. There was no denying that. But still, no. She shook her head and walked across the room to one of the beds. She thanked the gods that Shoto had found them a room with 2 beds. Laying down, she covered herself with the blankets and faced the wall, trying to ignore the heat in her face and the lingering feelings in her core. Pressing her thighs together, she tried to ignore how turned on he'd managed to get her. She was just drunk. That's all she thought of this. As he stated, there was no situation where she'd ever allow him to touch her like that. But still, the lingering heat in her body was hard to ignore. Pressing her face into her pillow, she tried to think of every unsexy thing she could to erase the way Shoto's hands and lips felt on her skin. She didn't even turn to look at him when he emerged from the bathroom and crawled into his own bed. She was embarrassed enough. She didn't need to say anything else to him. "We'll keep the other agency tailing our previous target while we go check this out," Shoto said, eyeing the map he'd pulled up on his phone. The coordinated seemed to lead them to an unassuming warehouse, about 10 miles out of the city. It would be a little hike to get out there, but they needed to check it out. "Okay," Katsumi replied. She'd been quiet today, not wanting to press Shoto too far like she had the night before. While she wasn't drunk enough to forget the things that had happened, she wished she was, because now, every time he looked at her, she was searching his eyes, trying to find answers to why he did that. Well, she knew why, or at least what he told her. But there still felt like more. She wondered if he'd been as turned on as she was from that little encounter. Shaking her head, she decided it wasn't worthwhile to focus on that. She needed to be focusing on the mission in front of her. It was still early in the morning, and even if they left now, they wouldn't be there until late afternoon. "If we wait until nightfall to approach the place, it'll be easier for me to sneak around," Katsumi told him. "I think it's best if just I go in, and you stay outside and keep an eye on things. I can wait on standby and be there if something goes wrong," he added. Katsumi nodded. After leaving the hotel, they instantly headed for the location given to her by the stranger last night. She hoped that he hadn't been lying to her, but she didn't think that he was. This was their best chance at finally finishing this team up. The faster they tied up all the loose ends, the quicker she could get out of Shoto's presence, which had grown only more awkward and tiresome since yesterday. As they walked through the forest outside the city, Shoto said nothing to her, and wouldn't even look at her. He was normally pretty cold with her, but he was acting even more so today, and it was bothering her. She didn't want what happened to throw a wrench in the small patch of even ground they'd found with each other over the last couple of days. Taking into account Uraraka's request to get along with him to help their agencies get along in the future, she tried to start a conversation. "Did you ever go camping as a kid?" she asked, not sure what else to say. They were in the woods, and it was the only thing Katsumi could think to say. "What?" he asked, giving her a strange look. "I was just thinking about camping. I wondered if that was something you like." She cringed at her own words, but wasn't sure how else to move past her awkward question, since it was already out there. "My family didn't spend a lot of time together like that growing up," he stated plainly. "My father wasn't into the whole bonding thing." "I get that," Katsumi replied. "I didn't do a lot when I was a kid, other than school. My father was mostly interested in training me to become a hero. There wasn't much room for anything else." "That's how my mom was," she told him. "She was pretty intense." "You didn't ever talk about your parents much, not even back in school." "Why is that?" he asked. She wasn't sure he knew what he was asking. There were reasons she didn't talk about it. Her dad drank away his life her entire childhood, and her mom pushed her past her limits on the daily, claiming it was hero training. There was no way he could understand something like that. If anything, it would be more ammunition for him to tease her with. "They weren't very good parents," she stated. "That puts it simply, I guess. Mom was intense, Dad wasn't really there. My dad died before I came to UA. Mom. Well, I don't know what happened with her. She left. She wasn't sure why she was opening up to him at all. No one ever understood her, so it wasn't something she talked about a lot. It didn't define her, anyway. There was no reason she should be talking about it now. My father was obsessed with training me as a child. Other than that, he wasn't much of a father figure at all, he told her. My mother. She hated my father. She ended up in the hospital after some things happened, and wasn't there for much of my childhood after that. Though, we've reconnected over the last few years. That's lucky, Katsumi told him. Well, not all the other stuff. But about your mom, I mean. She stepped over a felled tree and Shoto followed, falling back in step with her after a second. I think it was my mom's fault. What happened with my dad? What happened? He gave her a sideways glance, and she couldn't read the look he was giving her. She didn't know why, but she felt like she could open up to him. She'd never really done that with anyone else before, so she supposed it was because it felt good to get it off her chest. Even when she went into therapy after everything, she never really talked. She'd been bottling everything up all these years, letting it fuel her attitude and drive. He killed himself. She brushed her hand along the trunk of a tree, looking away from Shoto, not sure what he'd say next. No one ever knew what to say when you tell them your parents are dead and or missing. It was an awkward conversation topic she didn't often linger on. I'm sorry to hear that, he responded, keeping his eyes ahead. Well, what can you do? Katsumi responded, brushing off the subject. She cringed at herself for trauma dumping on him like that. But there was nothing to do about it now. All of that from a simple question about camping. It did make her more curious about him, but there wouldn't be time to ask. Just over the hill, the warehouse was coming into view, and it was time to suit up. Katsumi cleared her head of everything and looked out at the building, already trying to think of the best way to get in without being caught. Shoto and Katsumi rounded the building a few times before they decided on a window in the rear that had been busted out. The window didn't look to be lit up from the inside, so she would be able to use her shadows to help her get around in there. They were after a floor plan of the place, so that they could come back at a later time and raid the building and clear out all of the villains that Mindmaker had been gathering. They wanted to stop this thing before it was able to sprout wings and take off, like the last time a group of villains had gathered. From the intel they had, they weren't sure how Mindmaker was able to control his victims, or how many he was able to control at a time. It was totally plausible that some of the people inside weren't even there of their own free will. But they'd cross that bridge when they got to it. His abilities made it seem that he was able to control people for longer periods, and from longer distances than any mind control quirk they'd seen before. Katsuki was also hoping she might be able to find more out about Mindmaker's quirk, if she was able to get in close enough to see him in action. That wasn't the goal here, though. Shoto made it clear that he wanted her in and out as fast as she could, only gathering intel that would help them for a future attack, nothing more. Honestly, she thought him a bit more tedious and protective than he ought to be. He knew the stakes as well as she did, and knew that she should be doing everything in her power to get the intel they were after. The sun had finally set, and a thick darkness covered the forest. From the outside, the warehouse appeared to be completely abandoned, but Katsumi had no idea what she'd find when she made her way inside. Shoto tapped the communication device in Katsumi's ear. Keep this on at all times. I need to know what's going on in there, and do not be afraid to ask for help if you find yourself in a difficult situation. I want you in and out of there in one piece, okay? Yep, I've got it, she told him. She was used to this sort of thing. Stealth was one of her main attributes as a hero, so this was nothing new. The stakes seemed higher, but this was really just a run-of-the-mill mission in her books. It was nothing she hadn't seen before. She summoned her shadow wings and prepared to take off toward the warehouse. But Shoto grabbed her arm. What? She snapped. He gave her a meaningful look. "Please just be careful," he told her. "I will," she said, rolling her eyes. She took off toward the warehouse without looking back. She flew to the window on the second story, gripping the edge of the windowsill upon her approach, leaning softly against the siding of the building. Landing inside almost soundlessly, she swung through the broken-out window and sank against the wall, pulling the shadows around herself to conceal her presence. She didn't see or hear anything upon entry, but that was no reason to get comfortable. Following the contours of the dark hallway, she made her way deeper inside the warehouse. Footsteps suddenly sounded to her left, and her head whipped in the direction of the sound. She didn't see anything but still sank into the shadows and held her body close to the wall. She needed to work her way across the second floor, then probably hit the first to see what was there as well. So far, the second floor seemed mostly empty, a labyrinth of abandoned offices and rooms. Katsumi found a staircase at the end of the hallway, and as she cracked open the door, she heard voices filtering up through the stairwell. There were no footsteps to be heard, so she gathered that the first floor must be where they were keeping everyone. "How's it going?" Shoto asked on the communicator, causing her to jump. She leaned back against the wall and sucked in a breath. "I've cleared the second floor, and I'm getting ready to move on to the first," she whispered. "Second floor is pretty much empty. Keep me updated if anything goes wrong," he told her. "I will," she replied. Easing herself down the stairs in a shroud of shadows, she listened for the voices she heard before. The first floor sounded much livelier, and when she reached the bottom, she saw why. Moving through the hallway connecting the rooms, almost every room seemed to be full of people, probably enough to total somewhere between 75 to 100 thugs. Keeping herself against the wall, she tried to look for any sign of their leader, but he was nowhere to be found. She knew there was a third floor she'd yet to check out, so finding him there would be her best bet. From the looks of things, they were already amassing more numbers than they'd previously thought, and were equipped to take on many more. The building itself was pretty run down, and was probably just a temporary solution for a community of this size. She wondered how Mindmaker was keeping them all fed and warm, given the shabbiness of the place. Sneaking into a far corner away from where anyone could hear her, she relayed this new information to Shoto through the communicator. "That many?" he replied. "Yes. We'll need more support than just us if we plan on taking them down." Suddenly, a set of footsteps sounded behind her, and she sunk as far back into the shadows as she could, trying not to make a sound. Two people walked right past her, looking as if they were searching for something or someone. That person could only be her. She started to slide against the wall back toward the stairs, and she rounded a corner gingerly, watching over her shoulder to make sure no one saw her. When she turned to head down the other way, she collided with something hard, and she backed up against the wall, getting a view of what she'd just bumped into. "Not what? Who?" "There you are, you little sneak," he stated, giving her a devilish grin. It was Mindmaker, in the flesh. She'd only ever seen pictures of the man, but up close, he was even more daunting. With piercing red eyes and greasy black hair, he was the exact type of person you'd expect to be a villain. He leaned his shoulder against the wall and narrowed his eyes at her as she backed away and prepared for a fight. She quickly reached up and acted as if she were brushing back her hair, and turned her communicator on so that Shoto could hear what was happening. When she backed up, she ran into someone else, who wrapped their fingers around her neck before she could even react, and her body fell to the floor in a heap. She tried to say something, or move her fingers anything, but she was completely immobilized by the mystery person's quirk. They stepped over her body, stood by Mindmaker's side, and regarded her with a sneer. "Hero filth, always poking around where you don't belong," he stated, baring his teeth at her. Now, my friend, that is no way to treat a guest, is it?" He looked back down at Katsumi. "It seems our fallen angel has fallen. How foretold? Tell me, what is it?" you were looking to accomplish by sneaking into my home?" He paused for a moment, perhaps expecting her to answer before he grinned again. "That's right. You're paralyzed. You're about as useful as a sack of potatoes now." He knelt down and leveled his face with hers, and his eyes intimately swept over her face, making her want to retch. His eyes stopped at her ear, and what she feared came true when he plucked the communicator from her ear and put it on his own. "Hello?" he said. Katsumi couldn't hear Shoto's reply. She hoped he wouldn't do anything rash. He was going to have to get back up before he came in here. That, or she was going to have to find a way to escape herself. The latter would be preferable. She didn't like other people endangering themselves for her. "If you even think about coming in here after her, you're dead. I will kill her. Then I will kill you. Understood?" He waited a moment before taking the communicator away from his ear and smashing it between his fingers. Katsumi would have cursed out loud if she could. She was so frustrated with herself at the moment, having allowed herself to be captured so easily. Somewhere along the line, she'd let her guard down when she shouldn't have. She knew better than this. She was better than this. Mindmaker looked to his partner. "Carry her." He nodded toward Katsumi before heading off down the hall. The stranger picked her up and hauled her over his shoulder, then followed his master down the hall toward a dark room. He set her down against the wall and immediately began to chain her up with an elaborate bondage system. Even if the paralyzation wore off, it would be incredibly difficult to free herself. Her feet and hands were cuffed together, and a cuff was placed around her neck that chained her close to the wall, causing the iron to chafe against her skin roughly. She looked at Mindmaker, who was eyeing her curiously. "You're a fine prize. Definitely not anything I was expecting. I'll definitely have uses for you later." The paralysis wore off after about an hour, and Katsumi thanked the heavens that Shoto never came in after her, or he would have been right there with her. She was on constant watch, someone always being in the room with her. She tried to covertly move around and see how much give her bonds had, but she didn't think there was a way she could escape all by herself. She would have to hold out long enough for someone to come after her. She knew the heroes were planning on raiding the base and cleaning it out, and she assumed they would come for her then. She only had to hold out and perhaps gather some information where she could. Meals came at odd times, and there were no windows in the little room she was in, so there was no real way to see how long she'd been there. Her muscles were tired from being bound, and her head felt heavy, having to hold it up the entire time to keep her neck from straining against the hold at her neck. The way she was bound made it so she could never quite get comfortable enough to rest her body. She assumed it had been about 3 days since her capture the next time Mindmaker entered her room. He entered the room quietly, and she looked up at him with a burning hatred in her eyes. She didn't like that she was being kept alive, knowing what his quirk was. He could theoretically make her do anything he wanted, and that could make for many disasters. She silently wished that he'd just killed her instead, so that he couldn't use her. "Hello, pet," he drawled, leaning against the wall across from Katsumi. He looked her from top to bottom, and she spat at his feet, causing him to frown. "The nicer you are, the better we'll treat you," he told her, crossing his arms over his chest. He pushed off the wall and approached her slowly, as if he were a predator stalking his prey. When he crouched down to level his face with hers, she tried to draw back, but the bonds made it impossible. "You know, we could help each other out a little bit, if you're willing. Favor for favor, so to speak." "I will never do anything for you," she seethed, straining against her bonds. "Well, that's the fun thing about all of this. If you don't want to, I'll just make you do it anyway. You want to keep that pretty little mind of yours intact. You should do as I say." She pushed against her restraints, trying to move her face away from his, as he brought his mouth close to her ear. He let out a breath, and she cringed as her skin pebbled. "You make me use my quirk on you too many times, and it'll drive you insane. I'll tear apart every wall inside of you until I can crawl through your thoughts and memories, as if they were my own. I will own you, pet. So I mean it when I say it's better if you just do as I say, because I won't have to tear you apart. Fuck you, she spat. Mindmaker only laughed. Katsumi had no power, and she knew it. It drove her mad to not have any control over the situation. She would rather be dead than have to do the bidding of a villain like this. Since you so heavily insist, why don't we start breaking you in? He grabbed her neck restraint and pulled her face close to his. What shall I have you do, then? He looked her over again before grabbing the zipper of her hoodie. He slowly unzipped it, his eyes tracing over her body as he did so. She was still wearing her hero suit underneath her jeans and hoodie, so she wasn't revealing anything, but she still didn't like the intimacy of the act. If she'd had anything in her stomach, she would have barfed. You're a pretty little thing, aren't you, fallen angel? If you promise to be good, I could take you out of these restraints. But only if you're good. She didn't respond. She didn't know what to say. He wouldn't let her out of them if she wasn't under his control. She knew that. He was playing some game here, trying to get her to play along. But she wouldn't. Mindmaker suddenly swept forward and grabbed a handful of her hair. He yanked her head back, and with the other hand, he undid the neck restraint. Even though she had more mobility now, she didn't move. She didn't want to test him. Gripping her hair, he brought his mouth to her neck. She thought he was going to kiss her for a moment before his teeth suddenly sunk into her skin, definitely hard enough to draw blood. She tried not to make any sounds as he lingered there. And then, something in her mind felt as if it snapped, and a fog covered her brain. She couldn't move, couldn't speak if she wanted to. Her mind and body were waiting for a command. She could feel it. The need to be told what to do, building inside of her head like rope pulled tight, just waiting to be cut by Mindmaker. He pulled away from her neck and grinned at her, with bloodied teeth, her blood. She felt so strange, as if a cloth had been placed over her, and she could see and feel and think anything. But she had no control. Are you ready for your command, pet? He asked, and she could feel that tension in her mind grow. He reached forward and undid all of her restraints, much to her surprise. She wished with everything inside her that she had control over her body, but it just sat there and waited to be told what to do. She begged her limbs to move. She begged her quirk to climb to the surface and break the villain's control over her. But nothing happened. I want you to take off all your clothes. Slowly. He looked at her with a devious look in his eye as he traced his tongue over his bottom lip. Her body began to move, and she followed his command without a single protest. He'd chained her up after leaving her in just her hoodie. Her skin tingled where his hands had been, and she tried hard to not think about him at all. He'd left her laying on the floor with her face pressed into the damp, mildewy-scented carpet. Her mind and body felt heavy, and she had a splitting headache working its way through her head behind her eyes. She closed her eyelids and tried to ignore the pain, but it was near unbearable. She was so disappointed in herself for letting this happen. If she hadn't been captured, this never would have happened. She felt so useless and helpless, and she wished she had been killed instead of this. Mindmaker had been right. He didn't have to get her to agree to anything. She would do whatever he told her to, and there was nothing that Katsumi could do about it. She hoped that Todoroki was out there somewhere, putting together a rescue mission. It was all she had to hope for at the moment. The next few days that followed were the same for Katsumi. Mindmaker would come into her little room, take advantage of her with his quirk, and leave her and her muddled mind to rot on the floor. She'd shut her mind off days ago, trying to pay as little attention to the things happening around her as she could. Whenever she was under his control, her mind almost seemed to turn to putty, and everything was starting to get muddled together, and she was having a hard time recalling things. Every time she started to recover, Mindmaker came back and reset her progress. She assumed he was doing this on purpose. Her neck and shoulders were covered in his bite marks from all the times he'd taken control of her mind and body. They ached and stung, and she was sure that some of the wounds were starting to fester from infection from the dirty carpet she laid upon. She didn't even have the strength to eat the food they brought her. They would come in and attempt to shovel it down her throat, but it only made her gag. UA Year 1, Hero Basic Training Class. Katsumi was just starting to get a handle on controlling her light quirk, and she was ready to use it that day for Hero Basic Training. While her control over her shadows was good, they were less powerful than the light. She was excited to show what she was finally made of. It was rescue training, and they'd be broken down into teams of 2. I've picked who I want to work together beforehand, 13 explained. We picked you based on how well we think your quirks work together, and we've given you all unique situations to work through. Then, they started splitting class 1 into groups of 2. And, of course, she was partnered with Todoroki. She didn't have anything against Todoroki in the beginning. Maybe he assumed she did after what happened at the sports festival, but she wasn't ever going to hold a grudge over him beating her. She knew that she wasn't likely to win in the first place, and she was simply proud of herself for having held out as long as she did. He always regarded her with a certain iciness, and it really rubbed her the wrong way. She had tried to be nice to the boy, but he brushed her off so easily, and that's what pissed her off. He thought he was better than her. He beat her back in the sports festival, but she wasn't going to let that happen again. She could be better than him, and she knew it. Katsumi wasn't moved to the hero course for no reason. Their exercise started, and it couldn't have been a worse matchup. Katsumi saw what the teachers did and why they were paired together. Their quirks were similar in functionality, his ice to her shadows and fire to the light. Even their countenance was similar. Maybe the teachers thought they'd be able to communicate well or something, but that wasn't the case. When 2 people are too similar, sometimes all they can do is butt heads, and that seemed to be the case with them. The whole time, they argued over where to go first and what to do, down to the smallest things. Only when they disregarded each other entirely was when they were able to get anything done at all. Perhaps you both need to work on your teamwork skills to do better in the future, they were told. They only scowled at each other. With them, it didn't seem that they'd ever get along. Even if they didn't outright fight, they preferred to stay away from one another, Katsumi thought. Present day. It's already been a week, Shoto shouted, standing from his seat. I personally can't justify leaving her there that long. This is no longer a simple raid. It's a rescue. She should be our top priority here, nothing else. Since when did you start caring about that little pest? Bakugo asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Shoto's heart was racing, and it was taking everything inside him not to light up the blonde sitting across the table from him. There were now multiple agencies working together to try and bring down Mindmaker's base, and they were all focused on entirely the wrong aspect of this. Shoto hadn't been able to go in after her, knowing it would be suicide to do it alone. He didn't like to think about what kind of treatment she was receiving in that warehouse. With a mind control quirk like this villain had, he could make her do anything. And it infuriated him to think about it. We've got to come up with a plan that will work, Deku stated. It's possible he's waiting for us to come after her, using her like bait. That's probably a given. So we need to know how to approach this properly. If enough of us rush the place, there's no way they can defend against all of us at once, Shoto responded. We can wipe them out and get Katsumi out. If she managed to get captured, they must have some pretty gnarly quirks, Uraraka added. Katsumi is strong. She can't be brought down by just anyone. It would help if we knew how Mindmaker's quirk worked, Deki replied. It doesn't help that we've got little to no intel on what kinds of quirks these villains have. Shoto paced the length of the table at the edge of the room. He wished he could just go after her himself, but he knew better than that. He didn't have a quirk that helped with stealth, and Uraraka was right. They had to have some pretty powerful quirks to be able to do what they did. He couldn't help but feel like it was his fault for letting her go in there by herself. They should have gone in together, and then maybe they would have stood a chance. He could have watched her back. Shoto knew she was able to watch out for herself most of the time, so he didn't like to push it, but everyone needed help sometimes. She would have fought him if he asked to go in, too. He knew that. She sometimes bit off more than she could chew in order to prove herself. She'd done that ever since he met her. Katsumi, no matter what, would never ask for help. Shoto should have just known to go with her. After the meeting, which got absolutely nowhere, Shoto headed back to his own agency to try and bury himself in paperwork in order to get his mind off of things. One thing he knew for sure was if they intended on waiting any longer to go in there, he would put together a plan himself. He didn't care what the police or anyone else had to say. Katsumi did not deserve whatever was happening to her in that warehouse at the moment. Deep breaths. In. Out. Katsumi counted backward in multiples of 3, something that had been helping keep her sane. She knew it hadn't been that many days, but with Mindmaker's quirk, it felt so much longer. Everything was blurring together, and there was no stopping it. She was either chained up and her body incapacitated by that one guy's paralyzation quirk, or under Mindmaker's control. Every time he went inside her head and took control of her body, it felt as if a set of sharp talons had been dragged along the back of her head, scraping through her memories and thoughts as if they were nothing. When he took control of her, she was forced to think about and remember things she'd rather not. And as she lay on that damp, disgusting floor, she tried to recall some of her favorite memories, only to find that they'd been muddled and messed around. She didn't think Mindmaker could read her mind. But whatever he was doing inside her head wasn't gentle. The more times he did it, the worse everything got. After having been there so long, Katsumi tried to recall why she was there in the first place. She tried her damnedest to remember why she was chained up against the wall. She tried to remember why she was being treated like this. She would start with the simple things. The things she could remember. "My name is Katsumi Ono," she whispered to herself. "I am a pro hero. I have been captured. My name is Katsumi Ono. My hero name is Fallen Angel. I was brought here because..." And that's where the memories stopped. There was one thing that she could picture in her mind whenever she started trying to remember why she was in that warehouse, and it was a familiar face. Shoto Todoroki. In her mind, she could picture his cold eyes and remember their feud. She remembered her old classmate and fellow hero vividly, but she didn't know what this meant. She assumed it somehow tied into why she was here. He wouldn't have betrayed her, or any hero for that matter. That was out of the question. Even if he was cold toward her, he wasn't a bad person. She didn't remember any of the events leading up to being here. Trying to remember only made her think of Todoroki, and she just couldn't for the life of her think of why she kept seeing him in her head. Suddenly, the door to her room opened up, and someone she'd yet to meet slid through the entrance and stalked toward her. It was a younger-looking girl, maybe high school age. She carried with her a tray of food, which she set down in front of Katsumi. Like every other time she'd been allowed to eat, the person bringing in the food fed it to her. They couldn't risk having her unparalyzed and unchained if she wasn't under Mindmaker's control. "He has plans for you, you know," she grinned. Her voice was low and airy, and her eyes glowed with malice as she looked at Katsumi. "Big plans. We're not supposed to talk about it. But I don't see the harm, with you all chained up like this. You're definitely not going anywhere anytime soon." The girl pulled something from her pocket, a small piece of paper, and looked at it for a moment before showing Katsumi. It was a small picture cut out from a newspaper of the guy she couldn't get out of her head, Shoto Todoroki. "It's a shame, really," the girl said. "He was always my favorite hero, ever since his debut. So cute and strong. It's a shame that you're going to kill him." Katsumi's heart sank, but she didn't say anything or react. There was no point in reacting anymore. She knew where that got her, and she wanted Mindmaker to stay out of her head as much as possible. After the girl left, she thought about what she'd been told. With their leader's quirk, it was absolutely possible that this was their plan. They could use her to take out anyone they wanted. She'd been wondering why they hadn't moved her, why they'd kept her in the same place she'd been captured. And it all started to make even more sense. They were using her as bait, and they expected the heroes to come after her. And when they did, Katsumi would have to fulfill Mindmaker's last request, whatever that may be. She felt panicked and helpless, knowing that they would come after her. There was no way they weren't already trying to figure something out. They were planning a rescue, but Mindmaker was already several steps ahead of them. She hoped with all her heart that they would just leave her here, or that she could find a way to escape herself before she was given the order. Nobody was doing enough. And Shoto Todoroki was getting tired of it. He was on his way over to Katsumi's agency, where he was to meet with Uraraka and the other heroes, and hopefully they'd be able to put something together this time. This was the last chance he was giving them to work something out before he went in there himself. He didn't care how many enemies he'd have to face, or what happened, only that Katsumi got out safe. He couldn't help but dwell on what might be happening to her. Their teams had been doing some recon of the warehouse, and it didn't look like they'd moved her from there yet. That meant they were likely waiting on the heroes to come in after her, and they were prepping a counterattack. But he didn't care. Whatever they threw their way, they'd be able to face it. These were just a bunch of low-level thugs gathered in one place. This was nothing worse than what they'd faced before. He stepped through the doors of the agency and headed for the meeting room to find that several of the others were already there, along with the chief of police and a small number of officers. He took his seat and waited for the meeting to start with his arms across his chest and a frown on his face. He had been preparing himself for the prospect that they hadn't gotten any further with coming up with a plan. But he would still be frustrated if that were the case. Once everyone was there, the meeting started. And to his delight, they had a plan. They went over the plans in chunks, leaving out no details. And in Todoroki's mind, the plan actually seemed to be pretty well thought out. It was better than anything he'd have come up with on his own. So he was thankful that the others had made headway. It was lucky that the warehouse was out of the way of civilians, so they didn't have to worry about evacuations or anything of the sort. The gist of the plan was that they would go in fast and hard, and hopefully locate Katsumi before they were able to kill or remove her from the premises. A small team would head inside before the initial assault in hopes of finding her before the assault took place. Then, they would all attack from different angles in hopes of being able to take down the small organization while they were at it. But Todoroki didn't care about any of that. Once Katsumi was safe, then he'd start worrying about the rest. He'd insisted that he should be a part of the team to head in first after Katsumi, but no one agreed. He would take up post outside the warehouse and use his ice quirk to hopefully help trap some of the thugs before they'd be able to escape. The others were forcing him to take up the part of the mission he cared the least about. He didn't let his frustration show in the meeting, instead agreeing with the others. Despite his personal feelings, he knew that the plan was well thought out. He didn't want to tamper with it and mess anything up. He knew that going against the plan could result in losing Katsumi if he were to interfere with the others' jobs, so he couldn't do that. Now, he only had to wait until it was time to leave, which wasn't until early tomorrow morning. He knew he wouldn't be getting any sleep that night when he headed back to his house. Shoto's house was small and empty, like always, when he arrived home. He took his shoes off by the door and flipped on the hallway light on his way in, immediately letting out a sigh. Even though his mind was completely occupied by the events that would take place the following day, he managed to make himself a simple meal. Ever since he started living on his own, he'd gotten a little better at cooking, but it was nothing compared to the meals his sister used to make growing up. He still often stopped by their home to have meals with them. But other than that, he really didn't have much contact with others outside of work. He was always working, and he had no interest in creating any kind of family if he was always busy, like his father had been. There was no point in having kids if you wouldn't be home to raise them, he thought. The idea had always seemed nice to him, but he couldn't imagine finding a partner who would be okay with his work habits. He didn't consider himself much of a catch. After eating his food, he readied himself for bed and laid down on his mattress. Unable to turn his mind off, he stared at the ceiling, occasionally checking his phone for any notifications, and the time, which seemed to be crawling by as slow as possible. He woke early the next morning after virtually no sleep and headed to his agency to ready himself for what was to come. It was still dark out as he made his way there, and the streets were cold and quiet. Shoto always hated the quiet. He knew what kinds of things tended to hide behind the cover of darkness. When he arrived, there was almost no one in the office, yet, except those who would be assisting with the mission, which was to be expected. After dressing himself in his hero costume, he headed to the police department, where the others were gathering and readying themselves for what was to come. Katsumi woke with a start when the door to her room opened. She threw her eyes open to see who it was, and wasn't surprised to see Mindmaker entering the room with a sly smile across his face. She sucked in a deep breath and tried to ready herself for what was to come. Her mind was already a puddle, and things were getting harder and harder to remember as time passed. She didn't know why she was there. Sometimes it took her a few minutes to remember simple things about herself, and Mindmaker was all too pleased to see her like this. So he kept coming, kept asking things of her. And he would keep doing that until there was nothing left, she feared. He crouched down in front of her and brushed a strand of her greasy, dirtied hair off of her forehead. She shivered at his touch, wanting to recoil, but having nowhere to go. "It's all coming to a head today," he told her. "It took them longer than expected. But you're getting out today, my dear angel." She didn't say anything. She couldn't will herself to speak, even if she wanted to. "So, I'm here to give you your last order." Another man stepped into the room, the one who always came to paralyze her. Mindmaker leaned forward and bit her shoulder, digging his teeth into her until he drew blood. He pulled away, his mouth dripping and red. She felt the sticky substance trickling down her shoulder, and she focused on the sensation rather than the man in front of her. He looked her in the eyes as he spoke chilling words to her. "I want you to kill Shoto Todoroki." She began to thrash against her chains, he body fighting to break free and no doubt complete the task she was just given. Katsumi's consciousness took a backseat as every part of her was filled with the urge to murder her old classmate and fellow hero. The other man stepped forward and placed his hand on her, and her body became limp against her chains. Her breaths rasped as that order stayed fresh in her mind, and her skin itched with the desire to spill Todoroki's blood. She was sickened with herself and afraid of what was coming. Mindmaker said she'd be getting out today. She was paralyzed. She'd have no way of telling anyone to leave her there or kill her. She had absolutely no idea how to break his control over her, either. She could hear the commotion long before it reached her. She wanted to tell them that Mindmaker knew they were coming. She wanted to tell them that he wasn't going to be here when they got here. This mission would be a total failure. Yeah, they'd get her back. But at what cost? She had no way of telling them that the minute she could move her body again, she was going to kill Shoto Todoroki. The enemy would be long gone. Any of the other people who were still here when the heroes arrived were only there as distractions. The thought sickened her and made her want to puke. The door to her room burst open, and she noted two familiar faces in the bunch, both former classmates of hers who had also gone on to become pro-heroes. Deku and Red Riot. She cringed when she saw their faces when they looked at her. She was in nothing but a dirtied sweatshirt, completely covered in festering bite marks, and chained to the wall. She knew she had to be quite the sight. She hung in her bindings like a rag doll, unable to move, speak, or even think coherently. Her skin itched with the desire to spill Shoto's blood, and she wanted with everything inside her to yell at them to kill her. Deku immediately rushed to her side and began to undo the bindings that held her in place. She fell limply into his arms, and he picked her up like she was nothing and started carrying her toward the door. She couldn't even close her eyes as he carried her limp body through the warehouse, which appeared to have been completely cleared out. Outside the building, there were many cop cars, heroes, and too many faces to count. Just looking around her made her head swim and ache. Her breath caught in her chest when she saw a familiar face coming toward her through the crowd, and her skin began to itch and ache the closer he got. Her eyes locked onto his, and there were so many things she wanted to say, but there was no way to say them. Even if she could move her body, she could hear the train of thought running through her head, and it made her sick. Kill, kill, kill. Shoto Todoroki. Everyone was talking, but she couldn't hear anything besides her own heartbeat in her ears. He grabbed the zipper of her hoodie, pulled the dirtied piece of clothing up over her exposed shoulder, and zipped it up the rest of the way, covering her by temark-ridden skin. His eyes were full of so many things as she looked at him. Guilt, pain, and sadness. His mouth was moving, he was trying to speak to her, but she couldn't hear a thing. Her pulse was loud in her ears, like waves crashing harshly upon a rocky shore, blocking out everything else. She wanted to tell him to run, to stay as far away from her as possible. She wanted to tell him to lock her up or end her. No one was yet aware of what had happened to her. Only she knew how Mindmaker's quirk really worked. Only she could tell him that he was in danger, and she was completely unable. Katsumi was set down on a gurney shortly after leaving the building, and Shoto followed alongside her as they carted her into an ambulance, and kept his eyes fixed on her as they closed the doors and drove off. Somewhere on the way to the hospital, Katsumi lost consciousness. Shoto paced the length of the waiting room, wringing his hands together nervously. He felt his heart break in two when he first laid eyes on her earlier. Her entire chest, shoulders, and neck were covered in bloodied and bruised bite marks, and she was so pale. She had been hanging on by a thread. Waiting for them to check her out and allow him to visit was taking too long. He wanted to see her and talk to her and apologize for letting her go in there by herself. He wondered if she'd continue to be stubborn about it, or if she was also upset she'd gone in alone. Knowing her, it was probably the former. The way Katsumi looked at him as Deku carried her out was burned into the backs of his eyes. Her eyes were filled with something like desperation. He didn't know how to interpret what he saw. He'd never been great at reading other people, but he knew there was something she wanted to tell him. She looked desperate, and he was too. Shoto needed to see her, talk to her, and know that she was going to be okay. He eventually sat down near a window and looked outside, trying to find anything to focus on to keep himself occupied. The trees were no longer blossoming, instead turning green, signaling that summer would be starting soon. Running through the mission debrief in his head helped take his mind off of the woman just in the other room he was waiting to see. There were far fewer criminals there than Katsumi had originally reported before she'd been captured. His mind lingered on her again for a second, but he shook the thoughts away and continued going over the mission. Mindmaker was nowhere to be seen when they arrived. Every criminal they captured were low-level thugs whose criminal records weren't too expansive. He supposed that Mindmaker and his top brass somehow knew they were coming and made their exit long before they got there. How he knew, Shoto couldn't figure out. What he also couldn't figure out was why. Why allow them to come in and take her with little to no problems? He had assumed going into this that it was a trap, but there were no such traps when they arrived. Clearing out the warehouse was far easier than they anticipated, and the amount of heroes they brought along had definitely been an overkill. This only made him feel more guilty. knowing how long it had taken them to throw the plan together and get to her. If they'd only just gone in sooner like Shoto had pushed for, she wouldn't have gone through as much. Eventually, one of the detectives and a doctor approached Shoto, and he stood up, eager to hear what they had to say. "She's awake," the doctor started. This should have been good news, but the look on the doctor's face said anything but. "She's completely unresponsive and won't stop thrashing around. We can't get her to respond to any outside stimuli. We haven't figured anything else out yet." Right as the doctor finished speaking, the doors behind them swung open, and a very distraught-looking Uraraka met them. They relayed the information to her as well. "Does she have any family we need to notify? She doesn't seem to have any emergency contacts in her medical records," the doctor said. No. Well, Todoroki and I are it," Uraraka told them. She looked at Shoto with a saddened expression, surely feeling as disheartened as him at hearing this update. "Can I see her?" Shoto asked. "We can't allow any visitors at this point in time," the detective stated. "She has to be sedated," the doctor added. "She's not in any state to see anyone right now." "I understand that, but I can't even see her. I just want to be sure she's okay," Shoto tried. "She sounds anything but," Uraraka added quietly. "Just let me see her, even if it's just for a minute," Shoto tried again. "As I've already said, we can't allow visitors. She's severely unstable." Shoto grunted and pivoted around, quickly exiting the waiting room. He ignored Uraraka calling after him as he slammed through the doors and found himself standing outside the hospital. He rested his hands on top of his head and sucked in a deep breath. He hated how guilty he felt. It was eating him alive. All he wanted was to be there for her, and he couldn't even do that now. All he could do was wait. Just like before, he felt completely useless and helpless in the whole situation. Once the paralyzation wore off, Katsumi thrashed in her hospital bed, unable to control her movements. Just like the many times before that mind maker had taken control, she'd been shoved to the far back corner of her own mind to watch helplessly as her conscious stream of thoughts took on a life of their own. The doctors had immediately sedated her after the first time, and she was now strapped to the hospital bed with thick leather straps that bit into the skin on her wrists and ankles. After having been bound in that warehouse for so long, she loathed that she had once again found herself living the same fate. She knew there was nothing that could be done, though. She hated that she couldn't even tell anyone what was happening. She saw the questions in the doctor's eyes, and could see their mouths moving as if they were speaking to her. But she couldn't hear anything except the pounding of her heartbeat in her eardrums. Her body screamed and ached any time the sedatives wore off, and every time that they did, more doctors and detectives would come in to ask her questions. Katsumi thanked every god she could think of that they didn't allow in any visitors. She'd seen the look in Todoroki's eyes when they found her. While the memories of everything before the warehouse were still a jumbled mess, she saw that he had been worried, same as everyone else. Shoto Todoroki was the only thing she couldn't force out of her head. She wished no, she begged for silence. But her conscious stream of thought screamed on about the order that Mindmaker had given her. Where she cowered in the back of her mind, there was nothing that she could do. Katsumi tried to think over possible solutions to this mess, but nothing seemed to present itself as a viable option. An erasure quirk wouldn't work on her, seeing as it wasn't her quirk that was at work, so someone like her old teacher, Aizawa, was out of the question. She wondered if the doctors and detectives had pieced together what happened yet. She was held captive by Mindmaker, so it would make sense, given her behavior, right? She hoped this was true, and that they were looking for a solution since there was currently nothing she could do to help herself. Shoto eventually went home later that day to take a shower and try to decompress. The doctors said they'd call if there were any breakthroughs, but so far, she was still in practically the same state they'd found her in. It frustrated him, knowing that there was currently nothing he could be doing to remedy the situation he'd put her in the first place. It was his fault. He knew that. He let her go inside all by herself that night, and he sorely regretted it. The guilt was eating him from the inside out, carving a hole in his chest that couldn't be filled until he saw her okay again. He leaned against the wall of the shower and let the scalding water pour across his back and drip down his face. He felt the water drop down and gather at his lash line tears and drip down in a steady stream. He intended to remain at the hospital until he could see Katsumi. But Uraraka had managed to talk him out of it. "There's no point staying around when you can't see her yet," she told him. "Go home, eat something, and wait for them to call. I know it's hard." Shoto shook his head and quickly turned off the tap. He stepped out into the cold bathroom and dried himself off before wrapping the towel around his midsection and heading to his bedroom. Without getting dressed, he flopped down on his mattress and stared up at the ceiling. He was expected back at work tomorrow, which meant he shouldn't be sitting around and sulking. He knew he had to go, too. They'd have to rework the whole patrol schedule if he were to skip out, and he didn't want to create any extra work for anyone. Causing issues for anyone else was the last thing he wanted to do at this point. As he stared up at the ceiling, he cursed the quietness of his small apartment. He always felt so alone here, and there was little to distract him from the thoughts rolling around in his head. He scoffed at himself. He was feeling sorry for himself. How could he even feel that way when Katsumi was going through the things she was? This wasn't about him. He decided to quit dragging his feet and get up off his bed. After getting himself ready for sleep, he decided that work would be the perfect way to keep himself occupied until they called. There was nothing he could do now but wait and be there for her when she was able to take visitors. The next day, when he showed up at his agency, he tried not to dwell on anything other than work. He wouldn't be going out to patrol until after lunch, so he only had to bury himself in paperwork until then. He sat at his desk and turned on his computer before combing through his emails, which was something he hated. Regardless, it was something that needed to be done. He was pulled from his workflow a little while later when his office door burst open, hitting the wall with a loud bang. "Oi, Isahat." It was Bakugo, who had the same angry and indecipherable look on his face as always. Shoto could never really tell what people were thinking, and people like Bakugo only made that harder, since every one of his emotions came across the same, with the same tone and facial expressions. "You're taking me out to lunch today, nerd." "Excuse me," Shoto responded, not sure what else to say. "You heard me." Bakugo crossed the room and threw his hands down on Shoto's desk, rattling the pictures and computer as he did so. "Get your ass up. We're leaving now." Shoto didn't argue. He knew better than that. Still, he was confused. It was rare that Bakugo made social calls to Shoto, so he was a little confused. He sighed and stood up to follow Bakugo out to wherever it was he was supposedly taking the blonde for lunch. "Don't make that face at me," Bakugo grumbled. "I'm not making any faces." "You just have a stupid face, then." Shoto rolled his eyes at Bakugo's back after he walked past him and out of the office. The explosive blonde didn't say anything as he led them out of the agency and down the street to a small noodle shop a couple of blocks away. Shoto sat down across from him after they placed their orders and looked at Bakugo with a raised eyebrow. "Why are we here?" Shoto finally asked. "It's not like you to want to hang out with me." "Pink Cheeks said you were sulking," Bakugo stated. "Pink Cheeks? Ah, yes. Uraraka." Shoto sometimes got lost in all of the names he called everyone from their former class. "I'm not sulking," he finally responded. "Like hell you're not," Bakugo roared. "You look like shit." "I don't look like shit," Shoto defended. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared at the blonde in front of him, pausing in his defiance when the waitress brought out their food. He gave her a small smile and a thank you as she set down the ramen. "It's that shadow demon girl, right?" Bakugo probed. Shoto rolled his eyes at Bakugo and his lame attempt to insult Katsumi. Even Shoto could come up with better names to tease her with than that. He didn't say anything, though. She'll be fine, you know. She always bounces back from shit like this. Bakugo slurped down some of his noodles with little finesse before turning his attention back to the man sitting across from him. This time is different, Shoto simply stated. It's really different. You think you deserve a pity party or something thrown in your honor? You think it's your fault, right? Well, it's not. Even I know better than to tell shadows what to do. If she wanted to go in alone, there wasn't any stopping her. But I should have at least tried, Shoto finally said after a small moment of silence. His words hung in the air between them, full of guilt as thick as honey. And her body, seeing her like that was. He trailed off, not even wanting to put into words her appearance when Deku hauled her out of there. And she hasn't really come out of it yet. They haven't really told me why, but I have a few guesses. Mindmaker had a mind control quirk. They at least knew that his control didn't suffer because of distance. They had no idea if it had some kind of time limit. Shoto assumed she was under his control, which was why they had to sedate her. Having not heard from the doctors or detectives, yet told him that they hadn't found a way to snap her out of it yet. And that scared him. There's literally nothing you can do about it right now. So quit worrying. We got her back, and she's going to be fine, Isahat. He knew that in some sense Bakugo was just trying to make him feel better on Uraraka's account. Regardless, he couldn't help but worry. That's about all he could do right now. Katsumi's worst nightmare came true the next time her sedation wore off. The nurse who'd been watching her had managed to fall asleep in the chair across the room. Karumi's body, instead of flailing around, was oddly calm as she woke. She was still in the backseat of her consciousness, still having no control over what was happening. For the first time during her stay at the hospital, her quirk decided to activate. This is what she'd been fearing. She'd honestly wondered why it hadn't happened yet. Tendrils of shadow slipped from her palms and quietly undid the bindings on her wrists and ankles. Like something out of a horror movie, her body slowly sat up and surveyed her surroundings. Then, in a blink of an eye, she shot out of the bed, and a set of shadow winds shot out of her back and carried her straight through the window at her bedside. The glass shattered upon impact, and she scraped herself across the broken glass, cutting up her still healing body. The nurse was awake now and shouting something at her, but she paid the woman no mind. Like some kind of sick puppet, her shadows wrapped themselves around her body and dragged her along. She could only imagine where she was going. The night air was cold on her skin as she flew through the air toward her target. She was panicking, but there was nothing that she could do to stop what was happening. The only thing she could hope was that Todoroki was able to fend her off and subdue her. Or kill her if he had to. The thought terrified her. She wasn't ready to die yet. But there was no way she was going to kill him. She wished she could tell him that it was okay, so that he wouldn't be afraid or worried. The last thing she ever wanted to do was cause problems for other people. But this was completely unavoidable on her part at the moment. Unsurprisingly, heroes came to try and stop Katsumi. But she was too fast and too violent. She worried they wouldn't be enough. Something wrapped around her midsection and pulled her to the side, crashing her into the side of a building. The glass shattered with a loud crash, and her shoulder was dragged across the sharp edges. She knew she was bleeding, but she didn't feel a thing. Just for a moment, her quirk deactivated, and she began to fall, but someone was there to catch her. A strong pair of arms cradled her weakened body. It was Tsukuyomi. He landed on the street below, still holding her body close. Katsumi hoped and prayed that she would remain unmoving, but her prayers went unanswered, as always. She convulsed and flipped herself out of Tsukuyomi's arms, but he was quick to wrap her in dark shadow to try and hold her there. "Fallen angel, you need to stop struggling," he called after her. When her quirk activated again, dark shadow was of little help. This time, her body glowed in blinding light, sending dark shadow packing with his tail between his legs. "Katsumi, come back," he called after her as she rose and started to run away. Her chest was tired and burning, but it didn't matter. She couldn't stop. Suddenly, Katsumi was surrounded by a smoke screen. She knew who was coming for her next. Her body was quick to react, and tendrils of shadow shot from her palms and fanned the surrounding area, leaving a halo of visibility around her. "Katsumi, you have to stand down," a voice shouted from above. She didn't even look. She just kept walking forward, fanning away the smoke screen as she went. Deku floated in the air above her, debating his next move. Moving in closer, he shot Black Whip from his arm, grabbing onto Katsumi's body. She struggled in its entanglement, but she was almost too strong to be held. It almost seemed as if her quirk and her strength had somehow been amplified. She'd never been stronger than Deku before, but he was struggling to hold her now. Still, he tightened his hold until she fell, and kept struggling against him. He came in closer and held her there, debating on what to do. He didn't want to hurt her, but they didn't know what she was after or why she was doing this. The heroes had been alerted that she was likely under Mind Maker's control, but they didn't know any more than that. "Katsumi, can you hear me?" Deku asked, a last-ditch effort to get across to her before having to do something he'd regret. "Please tell me if you can hear me." She could hear him. She was well aware of what was happening, but there was no way she could stop it. Across the city, Shoto sat in his office, still working on paperwork and reports from when he'd been gone. His email was still full, and he felt as if he'd never see the end of his inbox. Suddenly, his phone rang, pulling him from the stupor he'd been in. He picked up the phone and looked at the caller ID, seeing that it was Uraraka. His excitement spiked when he saw this, and he immediately answered the phone, hoping to hear some good news. "Hello?" Shoto answered. "Todoroki? Hello?" Uraraka sounded panicked. Shoto's heart immediately fell into his stomach. "What's going on?" "It's Katsumi," she told him. "She escaped the hospital." "Escaped? What do you mean escaped?" "Deku's trying to get her now, and there's not much I'm able to do but watch. She's not herself, Todoroki. Maybe you can come try and talk some sense into her." "I'm on my way." "Where is she?" Uraraka told him where they were, and he immediately shot out of his office and headed to the streets. Using his fire half, he propelled himself through the city and to their location. Upon his arrival, he saw that Deku had her wrapped up on the ground in Black Whip, struggling to keep her in place. Her face was contorted in a look of sheer pain and rage, and it wasn't a look he liked on her. It wasn't normal. Her eyes locked on his, and her struggle only seemed to increase. Katsumi was screaming something now, though he couldn't understand what she was trying to say. Without thinking, he rushed forward to where Deku held her on the ground. Kneeling in front of her, he kept his eyes locked on hers. "Katsumi," he said. Her chest heaved as her eyes pleaded with him. She wanted to tell him something, but it seemed as if she couldn't. Todoroki was panicking now, not sure what he could do to help. It appeared that his being here was making it worse somehow. He reached out toward her face slowly, but as soon as he was close enough to touch her, she lunged forward and dug her teeth into his palm hard, drawing blood. He recoiled and held his hand close to his chest. "Katsumi, please stop struggling," he said quietly. Shoto wasn't sure what to do. "We don't want to hurt you." The pleading in her eyes only amplified as he spoke. He couldn't figure out what she was trying to tell them. She suddenly broke free from Deku's hold and lunged forward, tackling Shoto to the ground. Her hands immediately went for his neck, her fingers tightening around it. She squeezed hard, causing Shoto to choke and sputter. He grabbed at her arms and ripped them from his neck and gasped for air as he flipped them around and pinned her to the ground. Still, she fought, riding beneath him, trying to get her hands on him. She activated her light quirk, and her body began to heat up to a point where it hurt to hold her. Shoto could stand the heat though, and he held fast. He knew she couldn't last being that warm. That had always been an issue with her light quirk, the overheating. He knew that she used to struggle with it back in high school, but wasn't sure how much of an issue it still was. Eventually, he had to let go when her breathing began to grow more labored. There was no way she could handle being as hot as she was, so he had to relent. He shot up to his feet and launched an ice wall between the two of them. Deku had closed in on her rear, but she paid him no mind. It seemed that Katsumi only had it out for Shoto. The ice wall didn't seem to do anything, and Katsumi lashed out with a bang of light, breaking straight through it to lunge for Shoto again. Deku was on her again, wrapping her up in his black whip. Shoto tried to go toward her again, but someone grabbed his shoulders. He whipped his head around to see another one of his old classmates, Tsukuyomi. "It's best if you stay back, friend," he told Shoto. "She seems to be after you specifically." Shoto looked back at Katsumi to see that her eyes were still fixed on him as she screamed and fought against Deku's black whip. Police were now working a perimeter around them, and he could see them hauling out an Iron Maiden. His heart broke seeing her like this, knowing there was absolutely nothing he could do. Whatever hold that Mind Maker had on her seemed to be completely unrelenting. She wasn't able to fight it at all.